Well, hello and welcome to this Christmas webinar. We're looking at wastes of Christmas past, present and future. Thanks very much for joining us. We're expecting an hour of chat, fun and some beautiful music over the next hour. I've got some great guests joining me today. As you've probably seen in the waiting room, we've got Gill from the Museum of London Archeology to talk about waste past. We've got Sarah Knapp, my colleague from Integrated Skills, who's going to talk to us about her findings and understanding of waste present. And then we've got Sarahjane Widdowson and Paul Frith, who are going to actually be talking about waste future. In between all of that, we're weaving some quiz questions, and then we're going to hear some lovely music from a pianist and composer, Simeon Walker. So thanks very much for joining us. I don't know if you like me, but I wonder if you're kind of about quizzed out after a year of lockdown, but we thought it probably wouldn't be a proper Christmas event without some sort of quiz. So we thought we'd actually make them as valuable quiz questions as possible. So we're actually only going to be asking you 3 quiz questions, and for each of those, there's a prize to be won. So what could be better than that? So actually, just to get you in the habit and find out how to work this, we thought that we would go straight into the first quiz question, and the quiz questions will go like this. We'll ask the question, I will ask them, and we've got other people who are going to be asking the questions for those 3 questions, and then the first person to actually enter the correct answer in the chat box at the bottom right will actually win the prize. What could be more simple? So let's start. The first question, and because we're picking up this whole theme of A Christmas Carol and Dickens, and with various references to Dickens throughout the session, just because it's Christmas, but also because it actually gives us a time frame to talk about what we're talking about today, I thought I'd ask a Dickens question, and actually specifically relevant to A Christmas Carol. So this is the question. The Christmas Carol, not just a ghost story. Charles Dickens was actually very political, and he was always advocating for the poor in many of his novels. So in the early scenes in A Christmas Carol, Ebenezer Scrooge was approached by 2 men who were collecting donations for the poor. And so Dickens was writing about this interaction between Scrooge and these 2 men. So Scrooge responds to the 2 men that poor people should die and decrease the surplus population. Dickens was actually critiquing the social system in England at the time, and in particular one writer and theorist who said that war, disease and hunger were positive checks on overpopulation. The quiz question is, what was that person's name? So first person to actually enter that in the chat box will win a copy of A Christmas Carol. Who was that writer and theorist who said that war, disease and hunger were positive? And we've got a winner. Thomas Kelly, a copy of A Christmas Carol is going to be on its way to you. Great stuff. Well, that worked. I'm absolutely delighted to invite Gill from the Museum of London Archeology to join us, and Paul Frith, who's actually going to talk also about some of the history of waste in the 20th century. Gill, thanks very much for joining us. I think it would be great to actually set the scene for this wastes of Christmas past, present and future by talking a bit about wastes past. And I'm asking you really to start us off in this and to ask you why historic waste is so important to archaeologists in the first place.
Right, well, thank you so much. First of all, I should just say thank you for inviting me to share in your Christmas celebrations. It's really exciting to be here. I don't want to fall into any kind of Malthusian trap myself by not knowing all the answers, but I will tell you some of the reasons why we archaeologists think waste is so important. At MOLA, what we do is we investigate the material remains of what people leave behind. And Sarah, who you're going to meet later, described me before this talk as the ghost of waste past, which I think is quite exciting. But I really did want to impress on your whole sector, the importance of waste for archaeologists, and particularly historic landfill, which is defined by the Environment Agency in slightly a different way. So there are huge research initiatives, particularly led by a colleague of mine, Nigel Jeffries, into the value and contribution of waste. And we have described it as sort of the richest repository for material culture that exists in the UK. So it's a huge archival resource for us to learn everything about waste, from diet, wealth, culture, environment, disease. All those sorts of things can be determined by archaeologists for their different values. And we have really big research questions, which are sort of supported by lots of academics. So exactly, you know, what is the role of historic landfill in the historic environment itself? For example, you know, landfill sites take up sort of historic quarrying sites, and they are like the biggest archaeological feature in the UK. And what does it tell us about industrialization, modernization, and this sort of the triumph of consumerism? So I don't want to go on too long, but it is very interesting about those different patterns, trends, and behaviors that we can learn. And Sarah is going to talk to you later about how those can present themselves. But it's exactly the same model through history and prehistory. Early prehistoric societies didn't actually, mainly because they weren't sedentary, they didn't leave much material waste behind. But then as things become more industrialized and people become more settled, Bronze Age communities, for example, left lots of burnt flint, which is a big indicator. And then later through the prehistoric period, those sort of processes increase until you get to the Romans, where we always think of the Romans being quite sanitary and as having latrines and quite good systems, but they weren't that great on what their domestic waste, actually, and would often just dump it in the streets, which is fab for archaeologists. We love that. And then as you go into medieval and post, and big dumps of Roman material are evident across the Roman Empire. But then as you go into medieval and post-medieval times, there definitely is a change, you know, and that's where we see industrialization and modernization and consumerism. And it's a very interesting phenomenon, you know. Why do people suddenly need to have so much stuff, and what can we learn from it? So the Victorians, for example, we think of them as being quite thrifty and prudent, but Victorian Edwardian society is incredibly wasteful. You know, there's so much in the archive for us. And I'm wrapping up soon, but sort of centuries of old practices appear in this sort of post-medieval times as a result of this, more people having more stuff. And those are people like night soil men. If you were actually wealthy enough to have your cesspit emptied, you know, the night soil men would come and do that, and they would recycle that waste for, you know, fertilizer and things like that. And you would have parish scavengers and rag and bone men, and people like that. And people would have a personal sort of midden, or they would put their waste on a sort of lay stool nearby. So it's that movement from local waste to then sort of regional and then national. And by the end of the sort of Victorian era, that is all becoming obsolete. A new infrastructure is coming in, and very, very simple infrastructure to begin with. So it's just like having your own personal dustbin, having dust carts, and then later sort of dustmen, and then some kind of sort of rubbish sorting, exporting rubbish on by the rail and on down the Thames on barges, and then, you know, after sort of the dusty structures, this leads to that sort of big, new, incredible phenomena in the historic environment, which is the landfill site. So that's a little bit of a summary. I've got some artifacts I can show you. But
that's really interesting. Just a question. I mean, my assumption has always been that people in previous ages have been much more resourceful than we are, and you know, what you're saying is, well, yes and no, because actually there are examples of previous cultures who have been quite wasteful, and actually, you know, you know, the thinking goes that actually people, once they killed the deer, they absolutely used every part of that and whatever to because of the kind of cost of doing that and going out and hunting something. But what you're saying is that's not necessarily true. I wonder if I could ask you a last sort of question that's been really helpful. If you could show some of your artifacts, that would be great. But actually, my perception of the Victorian wastes system was probably the rag and bone man, and you know, a couple of urchins who would, with sweeping brushes, who would clear the street as people in their finery wanted to walk across. You were actually saying the other day that that is not necessarily the case, and I think this would be really interesting for colleagues who are involved in planning and financing waste infrastructure projects. So I wonder if you could tell us about the project you mentioned the other day.
Yes, so this is a project that Mola have been involved with for our client Notting Hill Genesis, which was the excavation of the Woolworth Manor Place depot, which is a really early sort of waste facility, and it has, you know, thousands of local artifacts, mainly sort of things from the big R. White's factories that were in Burgess Park around Peckham. And so lots of bottle dumps. This is an example of an R. White's bottle. And they set up this facility at Woolworth, run by the vestry, the local vestry. So after the sort of Metropolitan Management Plan Act, local vestries sorted out roads and waste and things like that. And they set that up to take all the road sweepings and refuse and manure from the roads and everything and put it at this place in Woolworth, and set up the rail. Of course, by the 1850s, the railway was coming in. So they had this sort of railway viaduct and depot where the waste was going to be transported. The brick dust, etc., was going to go off to Kent to be used in brick making, and all the sort of offal and manure and everything was going to be transported for fertilizers. And even, I can't bear to think of it as a cat lover, but sort of even like dead cats were taken and sold to furriers. And so it was a huge plan for recycling and transporting that through the rail network. But soon, people actually, and they even had sort of people like the Woolworth dust women who would sort through all this stuff and get it together for recycling. But they did actually soon learn that economically it just didn't work. The logistics of trying to make rubbish viable through this huge sort of infrastructure, which was very labor and time intensive, actually didn't bring the dividends and the economic you know, hoped
rewards
for
that they were expecting.
Rewards,
Yeah.
And at the time, people were saying really cute things like, "Oh, the unknown possibilities of a pot of rubbish," you know, as if it was like a pot of gold somehow.
Interesting.
So it's very interesting.
Gill, thank you. Please, enjoyed that. I hope other people did too. Please stay around, and we'll speak to you later. Thank you.
Thank you.
Cheers, Paul. Thanks for joining us. Paul appeared on one of our previous webinars, and we talked about options for local authority services. Today, Paul, you're going to talk to us a bit about what we've wasted in the 20th century.
Yes, I'm going to be another Ghost of Christmas Past before we move on to more contemporary ghouls. I've got some slides. I've looked back over the last 100 years or so to see what we can find in terms of waste composition changes. So as Gill was referring to there, it's obviously an indicator of how we live our lives. And here's three waste composition analysis, one from the 30s, one from the 50s, and one from the 60s. And so I wanted to talk about those 20th century changes a bit. And in terms of waste, It's a tale dominated by domestic heating, wars, and consumerism. So I'm going to focus on a couple of those. The concept of built-in obsolescence was something that was introduced in response to the Great Depression in the 1920s, when there was a need to and a desire to get the economy moving and keep people busy. And so to make more, something that fails, it doesn't last, and then to buy more and basically have a sort of a virtuous economic circle in terms of that approach, which works if you don't have a finite resource and environmental impacts associated, which of course we know that we have both of those things. And also wider than that, other concepts like the concept of fashion, you know, seasonal or annual fashion, where it doesn't become obsolete because it's broken or it's worn out. It becomes obsolete because it's aesthetically redundant. You know, it's not desired anymore. So those are sort of elements that have developed. And obviously during this period of the 20th century, consumerism did start to develop, and knocked back by the wars, but did start to develop over that period of time. And you'll see from these graphs here how, particularly if you look at 1965, how the amount of cinders and ash, which is that blue bar at the bottom, really dropped away, and as more central heating and less solid fuels were used. And this was partly also in response to clean air legislation driving down the use of solid fuels. But then you'll see those other bars which are increasing above it, which are more around containers and more around packaging. And you'll see right at the very top that little red line on the 1965 is the first sort of plastic that we've seen in the waste stream.
Interesting. Yeah.
So it's coming in the 60s. And an interesting thing, I was reading a publication, a 1966 document called The Analysis of Domestic Refuse by the Institute of Public Cleansing, which is now CIWM. And within that, in the 1966 publication, they had a long-term forecast to 1975. So moving from that right-hand column, what did they think it would look like in 1975, which I think is on the next slide. So they were estimating at that point that the amount of cinders and ash and dust within the waste would halve. And I think that was about right, actually. It was dropping away over that 10-year period very dramatically. And they were predicting paper would increase very substantially, food waste as well, and all the other packaging streams. And in that blue bar at the top, plastics didn't even have its own categorization at this point. So, but it's within the other. And when they were looking at key factors and influences why these changes would happen, they cited primarily government policy around the use of domestic fuel and clean air legislation. They were projecting a gross national product rise of 4% a year, and then paper packaging would increase by similar margin each year. And the unclassified debris is likely to increase due to plastic containers being used more widely for domestic purposes. And whilst there was very little in 1966, it was actually projected that that would increase quite significantly. And the next slide illustrates the composition of the household bin, if you like, over time, and the elements that are comprised by our typical recyclable type materials. So here we've got plastics, textiles, metals, glass, paper, food and garden waste. And you'll see in the late 1800s, it was dominated by, because the bar that's missing from this is the cinders and ash. So basically to take those up to 100%, you predominantly almost all filling it with cinders and ash. And then that drops away as we move forward, and you'll see the rise of plastics, which is the orange bar coming in the 60s and then moving up. And then the other packaging streams, particularly around food and garden waste, paper, increasing quite substantially over time during that period. So I think with that, I'll perhaps hand it back to you, Stuart.
Yeah, thank you, Paul. Actually, I am going to at this point hand back to you in a sense, because I just wanted to show the it's time for another quiz question. And why is there a bottle of Nadar gin there is because in one of my webinars this summer with Brian Main, I was challenging him about circular economy, and I was actually challenging him to come up with some examples of businesses that had actually moved to circular economy thinking. And well, I'd bit off way more than I could chew, because we had a fantastic webinar session, and there were way more examples of companies who really have started to build their business model on circular economy thinking. And one of them was this gin company. This is a bottle of gin that you can actually drink completely feeling no guilt whatsoever, because you're actually benefiting the environment. This is actually a carbon neutral product. So the prize is a bottle of Nadar gin. I must say I've never tasted it, and I'm looking forward to the winner actually messaging me to tell me what it's like. But I reckon it's going to be very good. But Paul, can I pass back to you for your question, please? And those of you who are listening, you know what to do. It's the first person in the bottom right-hand comment box to actually answer this question correctly. Thanks, Paul.
Okay, thank you. I'm not sure why there's a glass of peas there to answer that question.
It's actually made from peas.
It's made from peas.
Made from peas. There you are. Yep.
Okay. Wow. Well, I'm sure it's marvelous. So it's well worth. The question is, in 1928, so the first person to answer, 1928, the municipal yearbook, which I think is still around, conducted a survey of 93 towns and cities in the UK regarding how waste collection and public cleansing was carried out. The highest percentage used horses and carts, 63.3% for the transport. What form of transport was the next highest? Diesel-driven vehicles, petrol-driven vehicles, horse and petrol combination, steam traction, or electric vehicles? Oh. Electric, yes. Wow. Dan. Rob. Oh no, Adam. Adam got it.
Adam, yeah.
Adam, yeah, quite right.
Adam, there's a bottle of Nadar gin on its way to you, Adam. Yeah. Congratulations.
16.4% of transport use electric vehicles. And the next highest was petrol at 15.7%, then a horse and petrol vehicle combination at 4%, and then steam traction at 0.4%, no diesel. So well done, very good. And they were charged primarily by electricity from destructors in city centres. I'll hand over to a ghost of Christmas present, I think.
I am going to actually here at this stage, I'm going to invite Simeon Walker. Simeon Walker is a pianist and composer from Leeds, and I'm going to actually hand over, if our technology works here, I'm actually going to hand over to Simeon, he is there. Hi, Simeon.
Hi, Stuart. How are you?
Yeah, nice to see you. Thanks very much for joining us.
Thank you for having me. Can you hear me okay? Is that okay?
Yeah, absolutely fine. Yeah. So I wonder, Simeon, if we've been talking waste. I don't know if you've kind of picked anything, learned anything that you didn't know already about waste as a musician. I don't know, but I'm guessing there was quite a lot of new information in there. But I wonder if you could kind of introduce yourself, because there is a kind of link to what we're talking about. We're talking about stuff today, and later on we're going to be talking about our obsession with stuff, and actually what a number of people have found, which is actually kind of discarding stuff, starting to evaluate what we have around us, the things that are important to us. And I wondered if you could introduce yourself and maybe say a little bit about how we could link your music and your composing to that theme, and then I'm going to ask you to play a carol, your own version of a carol later on. So yeah, over to you.
Thanks, Stuart. Thank you. Hi, everyone. Thank you very much for having me along today, and nice to be part of your session this morning. So I'm based in Leeds as well, and I'm a musician, composer, pianist, teacher, performer. Well, not too much of that this year, but normally in normal circumstances. And so for the last 5 or so years, I've been doing my own solo project, which is has mostly been solo piano. And one of the founding principles of what I've been trying to do and develop it in my creative practice really has been about trying to think about this concept or this idea of simplification or simplicity. I think that's probably a better way of describing it. And trying to think about what it means to use notes and the ways that we can create a piece of music with some of the barest forms, the barest elements of music. It's I think in the past when I was younger, I had a view that the music which kind of had the most popularity, or that was most that wowed most people, was the music that featured loads of notes and was so fast and seemingly complex, and gave some kind of indication of someone's skill and ability by playing as many notes as they can as quickly as they can. And so I've kind of tried to sort of rebel against that really, and I guess the Marie Kondo minimalism kind of idea as well, kind of bring that into it, and I try to reflect that in the visual nature of what I do that accompanies my music as well. And so yes, actually trying to, I know the less is more thing is a very well used thing, but actually not so much less is more, but just kind of what can we use to tell a certain story, particularly within music, that just does enough to tell us that. And so yeah, it's very interesting to be part of this morning and to hear your approaches about other things to do with waste and waste management and things which I have to say I have no knowledge of at all, but it is interesting. I just recently released a new album called Winnow, which has more things on it, but one of the real things that I was trying to do, it has strings and drums, but I really tried to think about how do I still retain my sound and something that's authentically me, and sort of trying to value space and real spaciousness in the sound whilst adding more things to it. There's perhaps an incongruousness to that, and that was a really interesting thing for me, and trying to think about how to do that. So
can I say, Simeon, that actually there is a copy of Winnow for the final later on at the end of the webinar today. The final question is going to be yours, not now, but later on. You're going to be asking a question. The prize is a copy of Winnow, which I've got, and I would heartily recommend it.
That's right. So thanks to it. Yes, absolutely. So it's been a big project for me, and it's been great. It's been really good to get it out and to get it out into the world. So it's available to listen to everywhere, but also on CD and vinyl. And I mean, one thing I was just going to say, just in terms of related to this, there's a really interesting company in Sheffield who press vinyl called Breed Media, and they're using now they're trying to use old vinyls, so vinyls that have been discarded or not used anymore, to repurpose them to make new vinyls, and using packaging and things like that. There is quite a big debate going around in the music industry about how vinyls are manufactured and more sustainable ways of doing that. So
interesting.
That's just an interesting side thing. That's about as much as I can.
No, that's great. Please introduce this piece, and then we'll listen. And everyone, just switch off for a few minutes and just enjoy the sound. Close your eyes if you fancy it, but you don't have to.
Thank you. Thanks, Stuart. Yeah, so this is my my arrangement of the Carol O Come, O Come, Emmanuel.
Wow, Simeon, thank you. If we could have applause, there would be applause at this point, I'm absolutely sure. But thank you, that's so nice. I was actually away somewhere else there for a moment and for a few minutes, and then suddenly realized I was running a webinar. Thanks, Simeon, that was lovely, thank you. Thank you, yeah. Sarah, hello. This is Sarah Knapp, and Sarah is, she leads our waste composition analysis at Integrated Skills. Sarah, I was thinking that as Gill was talking, I think we probably ought to change the name of the team you lead to our archaeology of the present day team.
Yes.
But actually, wasn't it interesting? There's so much that was was common to, you know, what we talk about and what you do in waste composition.
Yes.
You know, the whole idea of historic communities, the waste defining who they are,
and it still does today. Yes,
absolutely, yeah. And you know, we can draw conclusions from the waste that you analyze and assess, and we can actually read into that a whole load of things that we do read into them. Yeah. I wondered if you could just take us through your sort of take on waste present. How do we as a society kind of ebb and flow and change, and how does different changes in waste composition you've found reflect the changes in us as a society? I wonder if you could take us through that a little bit.
Right. Okay. Well, yes. So I want to, my sort of presentation is all about what is currently having an impact on the waste that we're producing, and you know, the composition of, you know, the different waste streams. And I have a slideshow which Stuart might give to me. Oh, there it is. Okay, so my first slide is, I mean, global weirding, global warming, freaks of weather are having a major impact and ruining, you know, a number of people's lives with the devastation they cause. So there's one poor chap here with, you know, he's lost probably everything from the downstairs of his bungalow, which is well, the whole of the house, basically. Anything in the roof may have survived. So, you know, whether it's flash flooding or rivers rising, housing being built along, you know, in the floodplains, massive impact on the sort of instant waste that's produced. This poor chap is a 2-metre python, and we found him in the waste in Clackmannanshire in 2010. We didn't know whether he was asleep in the black bag we found him in, so we had to call a vet out. He was unfortunately dead. And at the time in Scotland, they'd had a, a very prolonged cold snap, and the vet thinks that he probably just, he died of cold, basically. The owner perhaps couldn't afford the heating bill, so the snake died. Other things that are impacting our waste all the time, and Paul touched on this, is the fads. In the sort of 80s, early 90s, we saw what was termed in the waste management field as the ground force effect. Basically, people were getting rid of the garden lawn and replacing it with decking. And I would imagine that fad will change soon, and we'll have a whole load of decking in the waste, and perhaps people will be replanting their lawns. Who knows? Yeah. Another thing, World Cup. Sporting events, but mainly football sporting events, have a massive impact on recyclables found in the residual waste stream. This was actually found in one single bag of waste from Guernsey, but it was very common, and the World Cup FIFA 2018 was happening at the time, and so perhaps more people staying at home, having barbecues in the home and drinking a lot of beer. Next one. Different times of the year. If I was saying to Stuart, if you beamed me down, Scotty, at certain times of the year, you would know what time of year it was. Halloween. So you're going to find a lot of pumpkins in the rubbish, and probably lots of discarded sweeties from the kids. In fact, we were going to do a waste comp in Northern Ireland, and they said, "Oh no, we can't do it around the end of October because Halloween is so massive." But there's, different events. So Easter will have lots of tin foil and chocolate from the eggs and extra cardboard. Christmas trees, wrapping paper, uneaten sprouts, Diwali, and which follows on into bonfire night with all the fireworks, candles, lights, and etc. So different events during the year impact the composition of the waste. Okay, so this is my bar humbug. The amount of uneaten food waste, untouched food waste that we're finding is just increasing year on year. It's just, this is food waste that's untouched from 30 households. And it's just extraordinary, and it's not getting less. We seem to be wasting even more. We did a piece of waste comp at a university, and the amount of untouched food waste from the students was, oh God, it would make you cry. And we decided it was probably parents sending their kids food parcels. And the kids actually just wanted burgers and pizzas, but they were sending them apples and bananas, which just didn't get touched. COVID-19. Well, I think we all know how our waste bins have changed since with lockdown, working from home. People have just done huge amounts more gardening. We did a waste comp in the Midlands, and some of the bins, garden waste bins, were too heavy for us to even move. We took scales out into the field just because they were so heavy. And some bins went over the weight of our 100 kilogram scales. They were just too heavy for that. So yeah, a lot of gardening happening. A huge amount of DIY at the HWRCs. There was, we found lots and lots of these sort of faux wood flooring, as people were putting in that, getting rid of carpeting and underlay and replacing it with wood flooring. And loads of toys. And one skip we analysed probably had about 200 kilograms of shoes in it. No idea what was happening there. And then with the decreased access to shops, there's been an increase in cardboard because for home deliveries, Amazon has done an absolute roaring trade. An increase in food, because we're obviously not eating at the place of work or at schools, and a huge amount of increase in plastic, glass and cans recycling. Not all of it in the right place, and often the amounts of contamination in the recycling have increased a great deal. This is my final picture. This is a chap who's been not beach combing but litter clearing on one of the beaches, and the number of, I mean, you can just see the number of face masks he's found.
Yes. I mean, yes, interesting. Sarah, my sort of final thought on this, and this is really a kind of question out to all of us who are sat on this webinar. My hope and my feeling is there's actually, during the lockdown, there has been something a bit. I know we've all been throwing out stuff. We've had time to do clear outs. We've looked at DIY opportunities while people have been furloughed. But my sense is that hopefully, maybe there is something deeper going on. Is there something deeper going on? I know myself and my wife, we've been thinking through our relationship with stuff, and my question really to all of us is, what's your relationship with stuff like? Has it been impacted? Do you think it's maybe been impacted permanently in a way? I mean, we're thinking about, sort of stuff that Simeon was talking about earlier on about decluttering, but also this idea of, if it's not bringing you joy, then actually get rid of it. Are we actually making choices and realizing that our whole obsession with consumption is kind of a bit empty, while we've all been locked down, and realizing that maybe other things like family, friends, exercise, looking after our body, looking after our health, our mental health is really important, and the stuff is less important? My hope is that that's the case, but what do you think, sir?
I don't think so at all. I think people are actually buying more stuff. I think that some people would have reflected on their lifestyle and maybe change it to the positive, but no, I think that we are a consumer society. Everything's driven by that. So no.
Interesting. Well, we need to think about where the end of that comes, how it comes about, I guess. But Sarah, thank you very much for that. That's really really helpful. Moved us along in the discussion. Thank you. I'm going to ask Sarahjane and Paul to rejoin me and move on to the whole idea of waste future. But very quickly, I just wanted to throw in this idea that I was mentioning there about choices, making choices. We ought to really be thinking about, I suppose, this year in line with Charles Dickens advocating for the poor. Just a moment to turn to a stat I saw the other day: 1.9 million people using food banks this year, which is scandalous in a way. It's a scandalous statistic. And those 1.9 million people obviously have no choice about what packaging that is provided in, the environmental impact of that. It's kind of where people without privilege don't have any choice in these issues. Sarah, thank you. Sarahjane, Paul. Sarahjane, thank you very much for joining us. You joined us earlier on in the year. We had a couple of sessions where we talked quite a lot at length about COVID, what authorities could do about COVID, and really appreciated your input. Thank you. I'd like us to turn to what is a really challenging subject, and this is waste future. None of us know the answer to this, but with the gift of a Christmas webinar, we've got the ability to actually forecast forward 20 years and actually look at a situation. Let's imagine we are in the year 2040, and I'd like to challenge us to think about two questions. One, we're in 2040. What wastes will we no longer have, and why? And then what new waste streams might we have in 2040 that we maybe hadn't expected we would have now? So firstly, I wonder if I could just ask you both your thoughts on what waste streams you think we will no longer have, what's in the pipeline in terms of strategy and legislation that means that actually we're heading towards getting rid of some of those problematic waste streams.
Mm-hmm. I think if I can just show you a quick picture of what I would like there to no longer be, and it's this stuff. I'm still trying to unpack my house, and all I've got is cables, old electrical equipment. I think if I recycled it all now, I could meet the 2020 target. Yeah. It's really
just in case. Rather than just in case.
It's an interesting question, because I think looking forward to 2040, one of the things that I've been thinking of this week is actually, we see the governments have signalled their ambitions to cut CO2 emissions. We've had those announcements around petrol and diesel vehicles. So I think one of the big transitions that we're going to see in terms of waste will be around end-of-life vehicles, actually. If we've got to make sure that, half of all UK cars will be electric by 2030, that's a transition of around 16 million vehicles. We've got around 30 million vehicles on the road at the moment. That could bring significant challenges for us, particularly with electric vehicles, brings a whole raft of different and new material streams that we've got to try and find novel solutions for.
Yeah, interesting. Paul, any thoughts on what we'll no longer have in 2040?
Well, I think I will hark back to the 1960s again. When they were looking at their long-term projections, one of the key things actually they would dictate that two things: economic growth and government policy. And I think the government policy one is the key one here. We've heard the sort of different views, and I know it kind of depends the circles you move into. And certainly I feel the circles that I move into, a lot of people become more and more and more environmentally conscious. Just not people I work with, but just friends and things like that. So I think there is a groundswell to try and improve. But the structure needs to be there behind that. And I think a comment someone mentioned, Ilaria, mentioned about, there should be more responsibility placed on the producer then. That's the nub of it. And I think, and we're seeing that, aren't we? We're seeing that coming in. We're seeing that start to come in. And I would hope that in the period between now and 2040, that will become more and more prevalent. And so it will drive those changes. So the things that the things that we see now that will probably be gone, things like the coffee cup and things like that. Yeah. The single-use things that are already, on the fringe, aren't they? People are getting a bit, they're losing their patience with them, and so those things will fall off. But I think you're right about the electrical side is an interesting one, isn't it? And whether we get smarter and we're losing leads now over time, aren't we? There's less devices with leads, but you still keep the old ones in case.
Talking about the city there, I was slightly worried.
So we will lose more of those types of waste streams, I think, over time. Paper's going to continue to go down. I'd like to think food waste would go down, but as Sarah said, it still seems to be going up. But as we sort of get more conscious about our consumerism and potentially as money gets shorter as well, we have to pay for a lot of these things. So would like to think those things drop away. We may see, going back to the point around, the big thing in the 60s was change in domestic heating. Now, we will see some transitions there as well, because it's very much to try and decarbonise the grid and to move to sort of either electric or heat networks, and there'll be heat exchangers, and there'll be bits of kit that we don't normally deal with in the same way now. So those, in addition, I think the transport is a really good point, and those would be changes as well, I think.
Interesting. I came across an article the other day, which is not a regular read for me, but I was looking at a document by the UK fashion industry. You can tell I'm a close follower of that. It was actually their report on this year, and basically they were saying COVID has absolutely destroyed the fashion industry. But what's actually happened? There were two themes that came out of it in their work. One was that they thought COVID will accelerate trends that were already growing. So they were saying, okay, move to digital shopping. So people are buying, and as Sarah was mentioning, people are buying a lot more online. So not going into retail shops or to the high street. But the second thing, which I thought was really interesting if it was the case, and I'd no doubt their research was sound. They were saying that they thought the other trend would be consumers continuing. I was reading it, continuing to champion fairness and social justice, and I'm thinking, okay, is that, you were mentioning there that there's a kind of growing sense of our responsibility, Paul, and so my wish list for 2040 is a continuation of something that work was started years ago on labeling, but the whole idea about being able to label everything that we buy with its environmental impact, but with its social impact. So how much raw material was used, how much water was consumed, how much waste is produced in its manufacture, its energy, any pesticides, poisonous materials, and all of that kind of stuff. That labeling products so that we're making better informed purchasing decisions. We can actually look at social labeling as well. So when we're buying a pair of trousers, we can see who they were made by, under what conditions. So that's my kind of hope, that will be full information, and we can actually make those informed decisions on what we buy. That's my thought. Any thoughts about what new? You've already mentioned you thought that cables might still be around, Sarahjane, but any other kind of wastes looking forward to 2040? What can we expect to be in the waste stream? Maybe that's not there now.
One of the things I've been thinking about is actually what we think of as the waste stream. So actually, when we talk about rubbish, we generally talk about our household rubbish that's collected by local authorities. But with the increasing amount of, actually with EPR, the increasing interest of manufacturers thinking about what sort of materials are, what sort of critical raw materials are in the products that they're manufacturing, I think we're going to see an awful lot more of take back, which actually might push consumers to reevaluate whether an item is waste at end of life. I watched a webinar this week where from TerraCycle, actually, where they were talking about different take-back schemes and relationships with manufacturers. And one of the initiatives was about used nappies, disposable nappies, and actually putting nappy banks on the street. And I thought, wow, if we can sort of target those types of materials and actually get the public to start dropping off those materials, so that it becomes second nature. Imagine what we could do in terms of the loops there. We're actually getting to a point now where logistically, a lot of the stuff that we're buying, there's capacity to actually give our stuff back. So, what role will local authorities actually play in the future, and will waste be waste? Is it just how do we think about that? So
interesting, Paul.
Yeah, just coming back to your labelling point. I think sort of smart labelling will come in over that period of time. I think we will have, a QR code or whatever it is on every product, which contains all that sort of information, which then enables you to firstly understand what you're consuming in terms of its impact. Whether we get to the point of individual carbon budgets, so you have a limit on what you can use. Might be going a bit far, but but it also, in terms of intelligence about that product and the waste side of it, you put it into your smart fridge and it says this is going to run out in 2 days. Have you thought about cooking this with it? And to try and reduce food waste down, to try and manage that side of it better. So just getting more clever with what we can do. So it's two things for me. It's like the policy structure, but then it's the technology that kind of can enable that, and then our lives sort of work within what we can do. So that's where I kind of see that moving.
Superb. Thank you. That's been really good. And we've actually managed to get through a kind of a story from past to present and future that kind of we've followed some themes. I hope people have appreciated that and enjoyed it. Thanks very much for your input in the conversation. I'm now going to head over to Simeon, who's hopefully still with us, and he's going to play us out from this webinar. Are you there, Simeon? Yes, you are. Thank you. I wonder if you could just help me first by introducing your quiz question. This is the last quiz question of the day. So far, they've gone really well, and everyone's answered the question. I just, well, I'll hand over to you, Simeon, at this stage.
Brilliant, thank you, and thanks very much for the lovely comments as well in the chat from everyone else. That was really, really kind. Thank you. So this is for a copy of my new album. This is the question. This American singer and pianist was famous for releasing the Christmas song in 1946, better known by its first line, "Chestnuts roasting on an open fire." He was the first African American to have his own entertainment show on national TV. Who was it?
We have a winner. We have a winner, Alison Crooks. The answer was Nat King Cole. Thanks, Simeon. Simeon, I wonder if you just introduce your final piece, tell us a little bit about it, and then play us out. We're looking forward to it. Thank you.
No, thank you. No, thanks again for having me. This final piece is one of mine. It's called Drift. It's actually from my first album, Mono, which was released in 2017. It's kind of harder to play the newer stuff because the newer stuff has lots more instruments on it. So it's good to play some of the old things. This was written around this time of year, really. My previous album was very wintry, melancholy, kind of like hibernation kind of music, really. So that's what this one is all about. This one's called Drift.
Simeon, thank you. That was absolutely lovely. Really.
Thank you.
Thanks very much for joining us. I also want to thank all our presenters today. So thank you to Gill King from the Museum of London Archaeology. Thanks to Paul Frith from Frith Resource Management. Thanks to Sarah Knapp from Integrated Skills. And thanks to Sarahjane Widdowson from Intelisos. And thanks again, Simeon, for playing for us so beautifully today. Finally, thank you to all you for joining us. We hope you have a great very peaceful Christmas and a much better 2021. That's all from us, all from me, and we'll see you again in the new year. Thanks very much for joining us. Bye bye.